Very good evening to you. My name is Neil Harvey and you're watching The Weekly here on RT International. First this hour, an emergency UN Security Council meeting on Syria has wrapped up in New York. It was requested by the United States, Britain and France amid the escalating conflict in the city of Aleppo. The gathering saw a heated exchange between the Russian and American envoys.
We have convened the Security Council today because the Russian Federation and the Assad regime have launched an all-out air and ground offensive against eastern Aleppo and its 275,000 civilians.
The main force in eastern Aleppo is Jabhat al-Nusra. Their overall number is about 2,000 fighters. The American side has basically acknowledged its inability to influence the armed groups it backs and honestly fulfill the ceasefire arrangements. Firstly, they didn't separate moderate groups from terrorists and mark them respectively on the ground. This gives the impression the main aim is still preserving the fighting potential of the Syrian government's enemies.
RT's Emily Siu has more now on the latest emergency meeting at the Security Council and what it could mean for Syria.
The dire situation in Syria was the focus of the emergency meeting today, and the UN Special Envoy to Syria, de Mistura, he was the first to speak, and he made it very clear that the escalation of violence in Syria is not caused by one side, but both sides of the conflict, that being the Syrian government forces and the opposition as well. But very often what we're seeing is the coverage of the Syrian crisis, particularly by the Western media outlets. Well, there's a very heavy focus on the consequences brought about by the Syrian government airstrikes, but very rarely do they mention what the opposition does.
The fury of Syria's military.
They seem to be employing bombs which totally destroy some of these buildings.
The Syrian government's all-out military offensive.
Syrian regime forces once again began bombing Aleppo.
Well, the Mistura, during today's meeting, he did take some time to elaborate on some of the atrocities caused by the opposition forces.
We have also seen reports of armed opposition groups firing Hellfire rockets. You know what they are? They are basically gas canisters full of clothes and of stones and iron, which are thrown in a rather rudimentary way across the other side of the line and do kill civilians. On the 19th of September, the area close to the UN hub in western Aleppo was actually hit with 2 mortar shells coming from the opposition, killing 1 civilian.
At one point, the Mistura also listed the estimated figures of fatalities and injuries in Aleppo, but he did admit that he cannot independently verify those figures. And this difficulty to grasp accurate information from the ground doesn't just apply to fatality figures, it also applies to materials and videos being released that claim to portray what's actually happening on the ground in Syria. On the part of the UN, the Mistura made it very clear that the negotiation to revive the cessation of hostilities must continue.
My appeal to this Council today is the following. Please, develop a common course of action to enforce a cessation of hostilities in Syria. I am still convinced that we can turn the course of events.
While the US, UN and Russia are all trying to revive the cessation of hostilities, we're hearing from the opposition saying that it's meaningless to return to a negotiation process for any sort of truce. One came from this joint statement released by the armed groups that form the Free Syrian Army. The other came from the official coordinator of the opposition, who not only described as the strategy for a truce as useless, he also called for the US to come up with a plan B, even though nobody knows what this plan B is. With the opposition refusing to join any sort of peace negotiations, it is unclear whether a cessation of hostilities can ever be imposed in Syria.
Let's discuss this now with former US diplomat Jim Jatras joins us on the line. Welcome, Jim. Now, during the meeting, the US ambassador exclusively blames Russia and Syria for the collapse of the ceasefire, but the UN special envoy to the Syria conflict said both the government and the opposition had carried out heavy shelling. Do you think enough attention is being paid to the actions of the rebel forces here?
No, of course not, because if enough attention were being paid to them, we would find that there really aren't any moderates. You have groups like Al-Zenki that cut the head off that Palestinian kid a few weeks ago and was accused of using chlorine gas. Al-Rasham, which is that other jihadist group that chased those Americans out of northern Syria that were embedded with the Turkish forces. The fact of the matter, there aren't any moderates to speak of. The reason they can't be separated out, as the American side keeps promising but never delivering, is that there simply aren't any moderates to separate out. So if you actually look at the ideology and the activities of these groups, it would basically reveal what the charade is.
What do you think of the Syrian government's decision to launch its latest offensive?
I don't know what else they can do. Again and again, we've had supposedly a chance to come up with a ceasefire, a negotiation, a political settlement, and then what you get then from the U.S. side, the Obama administration, is Assad must go, and the Russians need to ground their air force, the Syrians need to ground their air force, and nothing that ever leads to anything. And then after the bombing of the Syrian position at Deir al-Zor and the recriminations over the attack on this humanitarian convoy, I don't see how you can put Humpty Dumpty back together again on the ceasefire. I don't know what else the Syrians can do but press ahead with their offensive on East Aleppo.
Now, in terms of the bombing of the humanitarian convoy, Washington was quick to place the blame for that on Russia and Syria, but failed to provide any evidence. Moscow, though, has demanded an independent investigation of that incident. It would seem to be the sensible thing. Establish the facts, what happened. Do you think we'll see such an investigation?
We may see an investigation, and it probably, I'm guessing, will lead to the same sort of he said, she said about who really was responsible. I think the important thing is what you said at the beginning, though, is that immediately, within minutes of the whatever happened, you have the Obama administration making an accusation. Those are banner headlines all around the world, and then just try to go back after the fact and look at the facts and see what really happened. And we saw this with Aleppo boy a few weeks ago. We saw it with Ghouta 2013. We saw it in Bosnia. We saw it in Kosovo. We saw it in Libya. It seems to be part of the modus operandi of spinning the media for political advantage without really worrying about what the facts are to start with.
Now, the UN's calling for ceasefire negotiations to be resumed. The Syrian opposition, though, says it wants to go on to the so-called Plan B. The US-led coalition brought up this possible Plan B on Syria earlier this year. Let's just listen now to what was said.
Assad himself is going to have to make some real decisions about the formation of a transitional governance process that's real. If there isn't, as you've read in the newspapers and are probably hearing, there are certainly Plan B options being considered.
We believe that we should have moved to Plan B a long time ago. It was made very clear that Bashar al-Assad has two choices. Either he can be removed through a political process or he will be removed by force.
So if you listen to what the Saudi foreign minister at the end there said, it sounds like Plan B involves violence. What do you think John Kerry meant by it?
I think he meant essentially the same thing. Again, regime change is the bottom line for the Obama administration, just like it is for the Saudis, for the Turks, for the Gulf states. I assume it's because the Saudis are such big fans of democracy that they want to see somebody more representative of the Syrian people. Let's cut to the chase. The problem in Syria is you have an outside aggression by jihadist terrorist groups that are mostly not even Syrians, who want a regime change so they can put terrorist groups in power in Damascus. And unless Assad agrees to go, Assad must go, that's the Plan B. And frankly, it's been the Plan A for the Western powers all along.
Now, if you think since December of last year, Moscow's been demanding that the US exert that influence that it clearly has on the opposition forces there, so the moderate ones can be kept away from Al-Nusra and not get hit by airstrikes coming from Syria and Russia. Why has there been so little progress? Why is the US not using that influence?
Because, frankly, I don't think we have that much influence. This is part of the problem that the U.S. has had in repeated wars where we have supported Wahhabist terrorist groups, and we think we control them. We don't. Look what happened in Benghazi when some of the groups we helped overthrow Gaddafi then turned on us and killed some of us. We saw that in Bosnia and Kosovo. Again, we do not learn. Afghanistan, where did al-Qaeda come from in the first place? I don't think we have the kind of influence we pretend to have. It seems to me rather than influencing our so-called allies like the Saudis, they influence us. We act more like we're their clients than they're our clients. And then the third thing, of course, is who are the moderates? I'd like to know who the so-called moderates are that are supposed to be separated out. I don't think they exist.
Jim?